While the other panel members are pouring the water, I would like to take the role as chair. We originally had a moderator for this panel who, unfortunately, due to health reasons, was not able to come. So I am taking over this role just for now. First of all, I would like to give you a little bit of an update on how this panel came into being. We had conversations last year, and we were all encouraged, all the divisions, as you know, to create a 5-year out panel and talk a little bit about how our divisions have contributed and to what degree they have contributed to teaching research in communication studies. And so we got together a couple of people and basically have focused on 2 main questions, which you might have seen in the call. It's not in the program, though. And we were asking, the first question was, how has social construction contributed to the discipline of communication studies? What have we done, and where would we like to go in the future? This is a very new division, and it's a small division, but has been very active for the last 3 years. And we were hoping to kind of combine a couple of things from other divisions, so people really could focus on social constructionist work. So that was the first bigger question, and some of us will answer to that. The second question was, can we and should we see social construction not only as an approach to communication, but as a kind of foundational concept to analyzing, looking at, and experimenting with communicating? So we have all been looking at these questions before we came here, and I would like to introduce our panel members. Again, before we start, Karen Sedeker could not be here. Also, Professor Bach, Betsy Bach, NCA president, was not able to come. Some of you might have been looking forward to her remarks, but she was also sick and overwhelmed with a lot of other responsibilities at the conference. So she sends her greetings to all of you. This is John Stewart. A lot of you might be familiar with him, and he will be the second presenter today. Wendy Leeds-Hurwitz, and also well-known scholar in different fields. Then we have Teresa Castor. Teresa will present for Maria Elena Partisagi, who also, due to health reasons, was not able to come, but again sends greetings to all of you. And then we have Laura Black, who will also talk on public deliberation, organizational communication, and maybe I will leave it up to the individual presenters maybe to say something about themselves if they wish so or not. My name is Saskia Witteborn. I'm currently vice chair of the Social Construction Division, and again, I'm very glad to see all of you. We would like to start with Wendy Leeds-Hurwitz and her presentation. How this will go is we have until 10:45, and so each of us will present for approximately 10 minutes. Is that enough time?
That's fine.
8 to 10 minutes, something like that. And then we hope that all of you can join the conversation, because I think this is really the purpose of this panel as well. So thank you very much, and Wendy.
Okay. What I thought I would talk about is part of the answer to the question of where are we going next? What is it that social construction theory could be doing for us, and where is it going to be taking us in the near future? And what I want to talk about are basically 3 different things. One is a reflexive step, stepping back and asking a question about disciplinary endeavors at all. Then I want to ask a question about if disciplines are socially constructed, how does that happen, and what does it change? And then I want to ask the question, so what is it that we as social construction researchers have to contribute here? So that's basically the outline of what I'm going to be doing. So first of all, I want to argue that disciplines themselves are social constructions. They are things that we have made up. They are not terribly old. And like with other social constructions, once we made them up, we forgot that we invented them. And we think that disciplines actually exist in some fashion. And we think that the fact that you're a major in a particular discipline has extraordinary meaning and import. And we forget that what we've done is to construct a boundary around a particular subject matter with its own ways of working. And so the question for me, this is all very carefully written out, and I'm really going to resist sitting here reading it to you. If somebody wants the slightly more formal version with lots of citations, send me an email and I'll send it to you. But I don't really think you want me reading what's a fairly dense written version of this. The basic notion is that each discipline develops in its own way a community of practice, a particular set of methods and theories and assumptions, and a lot of taken for granteds that we are not used to stopping and questioning. And so the first important step is to be reflexive, step back, and notice that we have done this. We have made this come into being. The problem with doing this, of course, is that disciplinary boundaries don't necessarily match the exact boundaries of what it is that you need to know in order to answer a particular question you might want to investigate. And so what I want to try to suggest is that we need to stop and think every so often about what we're doing and remember to look at who else also knows something of interest that we might want to pay attention to, even if they say that they're in a different discipline. I think the notion that we don't need to pay attention to the work being done by people in other disciplines can lead us astray. Notice when I was putting all of this together, I was in France and I was noticing the incredible extent to which both their disciplinary boundaries don't match ours and the extent to which we feel free to ignore an extraordinary amount of research done in other countries, even if it's done in theoretically the same discipline, when we don't know about it. It's especially when it's in other languages, but even when it's in English. I was astonished at the number of times I talked with people and discovered that we shared common interests, but we shared no resources in common. We had different vocabulary, and we drew upon different sources. And I think that probably had a lot to do with my noticing the ways in which this is a problem. So if this is in fact the case, then the question becomes, how do we make this happen? What is it that we are doing that so thoroughly separates one discipline from the next? And I think the answer is very simple. We create a community of practice, a group of people we share things with, we know, we've read their work, they've read ours, and we can rely upon them to go in particular predictable directions because we have some sense of what they've done before and what they consider interesting. They're also people we've studied with, people who we've taught. And so we gradually build up a community of people who take for granted the same things that we take for granted. And that's a very comfortable position to be in. And I think it's a very dangerous position to be in because it means that we stop looking around to see who else is really interested in some of the same issues, even if we didn't know them, even if they're using different vocabulary, or even worse, the same vocabulary, but meaning slightly different things for us. The other thing is it takes a long time to become competent within one discipline. Why on earth would you want to go through that all over again? And especially when it's not rewarded and it's not even viewed as normal. 20 years ago, when I only did two things, I had somebody say to me, "You've got to be kidding, you actually think you do two different things?" And I was very insulted. Well, at this point, I'm very active in 4 divisions of NCA. I'm dashing between them, so I probably would say I do at least 4 things, if not more. And I understand that it takes some time to develop the connections, the competence, the comfort level within one of those areas. And so pointing out that you might want to cut across some of those boundaries is not going to be a terribly friendly thing to suggest, especially if it's not going to be rewarded. So then I want to move to the third question. What is it that people who come with a social construction lens can offer the idea that disciplines themselves are social constructions? Aside from coming up with that initial insight, what is it that we can offer? And I think we have a lot to offer. What I've discovered in doing a lot of reading by people who say that what they're looking at is interdisciplinarity, and there's a lot there about disciplinary constructions and boundaries and how we reify them, there's something I would probably describe as a black box, something that you know something critical happens here, but you don't know how. There are people, now most of the people who look at interdisciplinary work at this point are scientists because they are using what goes on in chemistry, even if they're biologists, etc. And so what astonished me was to discover quite how many people in the sciences with absolutely no training in studying communication end up writing about how communication is the key to an interdisciplinary project. They haven't got a clue what that means. That's why I'm calling it a black box. We wouldn't call it a black box, but they would. And so I think communication researchers, especially people with an interest in social construction, I think one of the directions we're going to have to go is to take a look at what is it that people do when they come together and try to cross disciplinary boundaries. Now, obviously, this also applies to cutting across the littler boundaries inside of one discipline when you're simply coming from, say, one division and looking at the work of another. I think the same process is at work. And I think there is a huge role for us to pay attention there and talk about it and do something in terms of helping people understand what is it that you need to do to make this possible, and more importantly, what is it that you do that makes it work versus the many times when it doesn't particularly work, because interdisciplinary collaborations can be very unsuccessful. So I'm suggesting this as a particular direction that people who are interested in social construction are likely, and I think hopefully will be going in the near future. So I wanted to just throw that out, and let me stop there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you. So again, we will just go through our own ideas and thoughts and then invite you to join. Next is John Stewart.
I'm really going to try to write down, watch the time here so we stay on time. Well, it sounded like from Saskia's introduction, when we talked about the people who aren't here, that this might be called one of the H1N1 panels. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not, but there's some feeling of that. A couple preliminary remarks, and then I am going to choose to read what I brought because I think it's going to be the quickest way to make the point, and if I just talk about it, I won't be able to be as disciplined as Wendy was. I just, last session, sat in on a retrospective on the Asilomar Conference, which is a conference held 30 years ago at a conference center in near the California coast, where the primary presenters were Gregory Bateson and Kenneth Burke, and the group from the Palo Alto Center, Václavic Bevan and Jackson, and a number of us from communication who were invited to be there. And one of the points that was being made is that despite the clear evidence of profound importance of some of Bateson's ideas, now there were disagreement about how they'd been appropriated and so on, but the profound importance of Bateson's ideas that contributed to such things as a reformulation of the notion of agency, which is a really pretty fundamental idea, whether you're thinking about communication or any of the human studies. Despite the fact that there was acknowledgement of the importance of that, some of the participants were wondering why there was not more uptake in the field. Even 30 years later, of course, Václavic Bevan and Jackson have done a very influential book, Pragmatics, and that language that's there and the ideas that there appear in textbooks, but there are a number of folks in the field pursuing approaches to communication that are not informed by those. And one could ask that question. It seems like as a panel we're doing a similar sort of thing, not just wistfully wondering, but trying to approach the question, what kind of uptake can social construction approaches to communication have in the discipline, and what kind of uptake should it have? And so it's intriguing to me that there's two panels doing growing out of a similar motive. The third preliminary point that I'd make is that for you as listeners, it might be interesting for you to listen for the tension between some of what I'm saying and some of what Laura is saying in her presentation. And it's, as I understand, how we're in conversation, how Laura and I are in conversation here, and we've been in conversation for a long time about lots of things. I would say that the tension we're working is one between coherence and pluralism. And my argument is going to be that there's a fundamental philosophical orientation that social construction works out of and works. And part of Laura's argument, as I understand it, is yes, and a pluralistic perception, a pluralistic approach in the discipline is a profitable way to think. So let me, with those preliminary remarks, let me see if I can work through this in the minutes that are remaining here. I'm responding to the second of the two questions. Social construction centrally emphasizes the relational conjoint character of all human meaning-making. Therefore, should what is now considered an approach be acknowledged as basic to all human and mediated communication theory and practice? And I'm writing, basically my position is yes. And because I'm a troglodyte and really old and I kill trees with abandon, I have 10 copies of this that I did. I would also send you something electronically if you'd really prefer to operate in an ecologically sensitive way. Anyway, my position is yes, it should. To clarify, this question for me raises a version of the question: what is the way things are for humans? The qualifier for humans is necessary because we can't effectively ask how things are for God or giraffes or mitochondria or aliens. Is it the case that everything humans experience is socially constructed? Is this part of the way things are? Put this way, the question sounds very much like one that would over much of the history of philosophy, been located in the realm of metaphysics. I talk a little bit about Aristotle's notion of metaphysics, the study of things that don't change, and the move to the introduction of the notion of ontology. And I'll skip that paragraph, or at least only sketch it. All this angst over the past 2,000 plus years indicates that humans are seriously curious about the way things are. And I think both the profound promise and the profound challenge of social construction is that it begins with a metaphysical or ontological claim, and the claim is this: things are socially constructed. This is an unchanging and crucial part of how things are. All things, including not only families, governments, as Wendy has pointed out, disciplines, which is certainly the case, religions and professional conventions like this one, but also chairs, walls, trees, and volcanoes are socially constructed. Volcanoes are socially constructed too. Now, it helps to clarify the nature of this claim by making a relatively simple distinction between that it is and what it is. Some people argue that if everything is socially constructed, then I should be able to walk right through that wall or safely sunbathe next to an active volcano, because if both are socially constructed, then they can be socially deconstructed to the point where neither the wall nor the volcano constrains human actions. But no social construction thinker, in my mind, would, and what I wrote was, with half a brain, but that's one of the more pretentious comments in a paper that I think is too pretentious anyway, would argue with this specious argument. I do think the argument's specious. That the wall and the volcano exist is undeniable. As Richard Rorty writes, nobody denies that. Nobody thinks there's a chain of causes that makes mountains, or volcanoes, an effect of thought or words, unquote. Brute facticity determines that I can't walk through the wall or ignore the volcano. However, brute facticity is generally only trivially true in that, by itself, that it is only establishes conditions for constructing what it is. What the wall and the volcano are is what's consequential. And what they are is thoroughly socially constructed. Of course, nobody would attempt to sunbathe next to an active volcano. But at least one person I've known in the past, a former student named U'ulani, who was a student of mine when I was at the University of Hawaii, would refrain not on scientific grounds, but because she doesn't want to insult Pele, the volcano deity, because, as U'ulani told me, Pele loves us. U'ulani, a volcanologist, and I get it that the volcano exists, and each of us engages with others differently to socially construct it. Importantly, the human world is populated 100% by whats. Whats that are interpreted from that's. That's are consequential because they provide often crucial affordances and constraints for whats. Interpretations would be another word. And that's do not determine whats, as the firewalker and shaman regularly demonstrate. When I talk like this, I think I'm simply reminding the reader or hearer of the obvious points that first, humans have no direct, unmediated access to brute facticity, that's, and secondly, that whats depend on what many years ago Kenneth Boulding called, quote, messages continuously filtered through our changeable value systems, unquote. Messages thus filtered are commonly called meanings. The human world is 100% a world of meanings, and thus 100% socially constructed. Understanding, interpreting, meaning-making, socially constructing, languaging is, as Heidegger reminded us, Dasein's way of being in the world. It is not the way we it is the way we characteristically be human. Just as humans cannot directly access that's, we cannot not continually interpret, that is, socially construct what's. Just one other point, because I think I'm out of time here, or at least running out of time. I think, does it follow from this basic claim that social construction is necessarily relativist? Two things. First, notice that this question only has epistemological bite if one assumes the possibility of a non-relativist stance, precisely because we don't apprehend that's. Humans might be classified as inherently or genetically relativist. But just as we can't time travel, at least not yet, our inherent relativism might simply be seen as a feature of humans, of being human, not a failing. And more importantly, and this is the second point, as a practical matter, social construction is kept from being relativist by the commonly observable fact that interpretations that are what's, if they are consequential, are continuously being tested by attending, as Hans-Georg Gadamer puts it, to what they come to in their being worked out. Coherence, efficacy, probity, impact, consequences, all these are tests of the social constructions we employ as we cope with all that confronts us. And when this testing reveals problems, for example, the world is not, after all, flat, then humans adjust. Okay, so you get the basic flavor of the argument that I'm making, that I think there's a philosophical position grounding social construction that renders it inescapable for people who want to think about the things that people in our discipline want to think about. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks. All right, Teresa.
For those of you who walked in late, Marilena Bartosecki would normally be presenting this paper. If you know Marilena, she is a somewhat tall, thin, blonde Italian woman. As you've probably noticed, I'm not those. My name is Teresa Castor. I've worked with Marilena frequently in the past. I'm going to go ahead and read and represent and represent her paper. The modifier in our second question, should social construction be acknowledged as basic to all human and mediated communication theory and practice, points to unarticulated conditions that preclude us as communication scholars from making that acknowledgement. Indeed, the statement of goals for this panel constitutes social construction as a choice among two constructions. According to the first, social construction is a taken-for-granted approach. It is settled among curricular dust that seems neither worthy of stirring nor cleaning up. Belying the first, the second social construction formulates it as an option for theorizing communicative phenomena. Though an option can indeed be a choice, the formulation of social construction as one among many possible communication theories is no choice at all. As John Schotter writes, we do not need any new theories. We need to elaborate critically the spontaneous theory of language we already possess. Because my answer to the second question for this panel is yes, and I see no other way to go on, I will first articulate the conditions that situate social construction as a grammatical conditional. I therefore ask, why are we posing a should question? What stands in our way? I argue that the choice between taken-for-granted approach and theoretical option is a trap of our own making. I then offer an example of social construction as a practical and consequential grammar for communication in the spirit of social reconstruction. As a questioning process, social construction calls attention to our own questions. Our second question, should social construction, makes sense as part of an exchange about doubts and disenchantment with our disciplinary practices and commitments. As Wendy Leeds Hurwitz argues in her own contribution to this panel, disciplines themselves are social constructions. We reify them in part by asking and answering questions. Vivienne Burr writes about her own misgivings with the way of social construction in terms of having the, quote, rug pulled from under her feet, unquote. Burr's expression is interesting in two ways. The first is that she uses bodily language to characterize her own disaffect with social construction's discursive enterprise, whereby the material world, as she sees it, is abstracted to an effect of discourse. The second is that by expressing her position in physical terms, she proves how discourse is no abstraction. She proves how discourse is no abstraction as we imagine the pattern of that rug and wince at her fall. The version of social construction that Burr, as a psychologist, finds destabilizing is none other than the taken-for-granted position we, as communication scholars, identify in our statement of purpose. Within this grammar, social construction means something akin to not necessarily so, or merely, quotation marks, constructed. In class, our students might be quick to offer that various phenomena are socially constructed by virtue of various social and historical contingencies. In class papers, they are proficient at showing how. These exercises usually proceed at first by identifying and relativizing vocabularies of description, showing their constructed nature, then move perhaps to an evaluation of the rhetorical potential with respect to other possible, as yet untested vocabularies. This sort of ritual, by which constructions are adopted or discarded at will, may very well be elegant, yet it is not consequential in that it cannot make a difference that matters. It stays within a notion that communication represents the social world, thus separating world from representation and communication. As Burr slips from her rug, she takes down the appearances of the taken-for-granted version of social construction from ever being able to satisfy the material and political conditions of those for whom constructions are not representations, but very real. As John Stewart's position paper illustrates so well, the epistemological version of social construction, whereby material things, be they walls and volcanoes, or poverty, or war, are cast as effects of discourse, is a condition of our own languaging. This version works well as an option for theorizing communicative phenomena, but only as an option, and only inasmuch as it relegates social construction to the way of theory. In order to work, this epistemological optional version requires that we separate discourse from other matters in a lose-lose proposition. On the one hand, we have taken for granted the ritual of representation, and on the other, all that really matters, the structure of power, the agency we lack, the material conditions, and all those abstract yet very real things that the representational version of social construction is not equipped to address. The trap consists in being taken in by our own languaging and constructing, quote, what really matters, unquote, as extra discursive, not a, quote, social construction, unquote, at all. As theory, social construction does not offer a grammar for social rearticulation. In a recent class conversation, I proposed that oppression is something that we create relationally. We had just read Deborah Cameron's Feminism and Linguistic Theory, a study on the constitutive nature of language and the dangers of separating discourse from social interaction. Feeling the iron to be very hot, I struck in favor of a social construction ontology. I said, before coming to the United States, I did not know that I was a woman. I was not raised as someone who is oppressed. It was not until I came here that I was told that I was oppressed. One student took my comment to refer to race. He said that though he might not feel oppressed, oppression still existed. I said nothing, but I know that I looked puzzled on purpose. Another told me how unhappy, and to be fair, she looked very unhappy, she was that I would be willing to say something like that about women. She could not just wish oppression away. It does not matter how I feel. Are you saying we can just feel differently and everything will be different? I said, you should know me better than that. Yet another looked elated. She announced to us, as opposed to just me, that if we were to do a study of how women talk as opposed to how men talked, we would probably find no difference at all. And then what? I said. What would happen then? As I responded to my graduate students' confusion, disappointment, and downright anger, I was alternately frightened, hopeful, and confused by what I was doing. The messy, very real, very material experience of living in communication while theorizing it is the experience of social construction as practical and consequential. As my students and I engaged each other in the exchange about communication and oppression, there was nothing taken for granted about social construction, and it was not a theoretical option. We are doing it the way things are. Because talk does, speaking of oppression or not, both upset and elated us. As students spoke to me, their professor, of what I was willing to claim and to what they believed, they spoke about the asymmetry between us and into that asymmetry, using it as a resource and shifting its arrangement. Some challenged my very warrant to use my position in the classroom to advance a claim they found dangerous. Another decontextualized my use of feel for the sake of her own argument, separating herself from things she could not feel otherwise. My responses to their challenges showed that power, oppression, discomfort, defensiveness, fear, rugs that are pulled and make us fall are all things that matter to us and are right that they matter, at some point at least within our own relational dynamics. And I want to underline verbally the word relational dynamics as a key point of Marilena's paper. As communication scholars, we are poised to ask questions that constitute social construction within a practical and consequential grammar for our social life.
Thank you.
I just really want to quickly add, Marilena had a lot of quotation marks in the paper, and just for the sake of smoothness as reading the paper aloud, I did not include all the quotation marks. So if you recognize some phrases from other works like Wittgenstein, for example, or John Schotter, those probably were quotations. So I apologize for making that. I hope that choice does not confuse anyone, and the paper is available if you'd like to look up some of the reference sources that Marilena quoted.
Okay. Thanks, Teresa. The next person will be my own self. And when I've been thinking about what has social construction done for me and also for communication studies, I came about, or I would like to make two main arguments. The one is that it has been rather enabling, but also that we still face a lot of difficulties in especially in terms of fragmentation with other areas of studies and in terms of the scope of social construction, theorizing. And actually in my own statement, I would like to, instead of propose a normative statement, an affirmation, although I would tend to lean towards the direction of saying yes and in terms of whether I would see social construction as the approach in communication studies. I would like to shift the question to process and practice. And I would like to ask how social construction scholarship in communication is actually based on cultural and ideological premises that we don't often look at and which make social construction scholarship at the same time fragmented. I also would like to suggest a couple of issues at the end, how we can go about it. And I appreciate the discussion, and the papers are available if you're interested, by John Stewart about the that's and the what's, and also the respond by Maria Elena about the remaining split between the things and the representation of them. I think this is a major issue that I keep hearing. It's coming up in a lot of publications, in a lot of panels also at NCA. How do we study what is out there, the material world, and the discursive world? What do we do about this? Can we as communication scholars provide answers to this question? And I think this is definitely one thing that might, at least also my own scholarship, will keep me busy in the future. Now, I myself see social construction to be concerned with the ways in which social beings come to an understanding with and about themselves in the world, in and through communication. The tree outside of my window or concepts like social justice matter only insofar as they are part of the lived and communicatively enacted, embodied, and contested experience of people, of discursive webs of meanings and negotiations. So on the one hand, the ability of humans to create social worlds is enabling, right? So humans have the ability to create, submit to, but also question and transform social relationships. And at the same time, by social construction, I think can help highlight the very structures in which we engage those ideas of oppression, power, which people approach from different epistemological, ontological perspectives. I think social construction can be a very helpful approach to help us deconstruct notions of language and discourses and so on. By understanding how verbal and nonverbal embodied performance is perception thinking and theorizing, people might come to an understanding that and how performance creates social worlds. Now, so on the one hand, it's enabling, but social worlding is also a challenge because we are influenced by social, cultural, political, and ideological premises. Now, arguing for a relational and co-constructed social reality means arguing from a socio-cultural perspective, I would say. Within the discipline of social construction in the United States, for instance, and also my own theorizing, there seems to be a trend of privileging verbal language. And I know John Stewart, for instance, uses the term language to include verbal and nonverbal, but I still have the suspicion that we mostly orient towards studying the oral and the verbal because it's based on the tradition of speech communication and so on. And I think that might be problematic a little bit. Scholars who are cited repeatedly have based their arguments on the verbal, like Bochner, Gergen, Heidegger, Peirce, Philipson, Schotter, and also John Stewart's. And I have a quote from Foster and Bochner from the Handbook of Social Construction chapter from 2008. Language is central to the construction of social worlds. So received notions of an independent, rational, and cognitively defined self are questioned through social construction's notions of a verbally expressive, and pay attention to the expressive and relational self. And notions, I would argue, such as the importance of self-expression, have come to be identified as cultured, however. This idea of we have to be independent selves, who have to become relational, express themselves, be out there, engage verbally. And examples are Carbaugh's research and also Catriel and Philipson's. And moreover, I would argue, those notions privilege one ideological framework, that of democracy, in a normative and liberal vision of how multiple realities should be able to emerge freely through participation, self-expression, and equality. Those visions are visions I embrace, but which I have to come to understand as limited in their universal application. And to play devil's advocate, the ideological bias in social constructionist theorizing comes to the fore in the celebration and recommendation of communicative genres, like dialogue, for example. So one task, I think, for social constructionist scholars could be to deconstruct those premises and also kind of look more into the prescriptive emphasis of those communicative genres called conversation or dialogue, and the relations between those genres and the political ideological models like democracy that this whole scholarship seems to be based on. So related to understanding these sociocultural ideological premises is also to overcome the what I see as a fragmentation in social constructionist theorizing, and expanding the scope of studying certain phenomena at the same time. So for instance, in the Foster and Bochner chapter from 2008, they point to three main perspectives of studying social construction. Which is discourse study, relational research, and organizational research. And I see a fragmentation within and between those and other perspectives. So, for instance, if we look at discourse analysis, which is a very broad term, and oftentimes people make those claims, discourses are constructed and so on. We construct ourselves in and through discourses. However, this thing called discourse analysis still seems to have its own methodological and theoretical movement and also claims its own rhetorical terrain. And so judging from work which is explicitly marketed as discourse analytic, and if you look at the work from Van Dijk, Scollins, Jaworski and Coupland, Johnston, and so on, there's really little explicit reference to social constructionist theorizing, which concerns me, except the occasional phrase that discourse constructs reality. And so disciplinary, epistemological, and ontological boundaries might play a role here, which is a topic that Wendy has addressed in her paper. So my question is, there seems to be this fragmentation, and there seems to be a lack of fluidity of boundaries and how we cite the work of others that might be very pertinent to our own research. And another example I want to give is the idea of agency, power structures, and oppressions. They have become important but also theoretically contested topoi in communication studies, I would say. And they also, at the same time, there seems to be a disconnect between constructionist research and research by feminist, post-colonial, and critical cultural studies scholars. The latter ones seem to work from a consensus that gender, race, nationality, and culture are constructed through hegemonic discourses. And you see all these terms, hegemony and so on, they could be keywords and buzzwords at the same time. But the assumption is that those discourses need to be deconstructed to lead to social change, and thereby they seem to be working from a social constructionist framework and with social constructionist notions. However, there's hardly reference to social constructionist research done in communication and vice versa. And I offer two explanations. First, I think social construction, how I have seen it, and I'm still a rather junior scholar. John? And I'm happy to I'm looking forward to reviewing this tape in 20 years from now to see how my thoughts and face have changed. But I offer two explanations. First of all, from my own experience and research in social construction, it seems that it's based and focuses mostly on the interpersonal. And also, although social construction is open to exploring the political, it is careful committing to absolute positions, which could undermine its own theoretical mission, the mission of engaging different and multiple voices. And again, this is also based on Foster and Bochner, 2008, who very much point out that this is the notion that we should maintain, being open to multiple voices. However, one consequence is that literature, which is cited in post-colonial and critical cultural studies, and which explicitly uses a constructionist approach, at least in my opinion, has found not much recognition among social construction researchers interested in interpersonal communal relationships. And so I just point to one example, like Massey's work on place and space, which is from a geographer's perspective. I mean, this is what people seem to be doing in geography, and I just attended a panel yesterday by organizational communication scholars who play more and more with this notion of place and space. And spatial relations between people and the ways in which social processes and practices create place in social interaction spaces, they could be important starting points for understanding co-constructed meaning processes within and beyond interpersonal relations. And the final point I want to make to close this, connecting what we currently understand as social construction research, and again I refer to the Handbook of Constructionist Research 2008, and I don't want to single this out because there are a lot of other very important scholars in our field who have written a lot on that. The question is, I think, to expand the scope of social construction theorizing from the individual to the mediated and systemic. And I think there are examples also already. From the verbal to the non-verbal and performative. And also from a North American, European approach to a transcultural perspective. And I think this is still missing in social constructionist theorizing. And this expansion in scope is in the spirit of social constructionism and its commitment to political action and community engagement. And I believe in the 21st century, the latter cannot be understood in local contexts only, but needs to be examined in relation with transnational, economic, political, and sociocultural processes. So reflecting on those premises related to theorizing, expanding the scope, and also overcoming the fragmentation, or addressing it at least within social constructionist theorizing, would be really pushing, in my opinion, the agenda of social constructionism in the coming years towards questions that matter. And what those questions are and how they come to be asked is part of the task. Thank you very much. Okay. So we have our last presenter, Laura Black.
Yes, I get to go last. Very exciting. I'm going to address a little bit of each question, and I have to say on the onset I found both of these questions to be highly intimidating. And what is the nature of reality, and these sorts of things. So my approach to the first question about how has social construction contributed to the discipline of communication studies, I chose to take a slightly more narrow perspective on that and think about how social construction theory and research and practice has influenced the area in communication studies that is most familiar to me, and that's the world of public dialogue and public deliberation. And in that realm, I think social construction has been highly influential. And I'll just give two examples. It's influential in a couple of different ways. First, I think people like Barnett Pierce and others who have done work in public dialogue have brought a social construction perspective to the heart of what happens in public dialogue sessions. So folks who have these different material conflicts are often based on their worldviews. And so Pierce and then other public dialogues scholar practitioners would bring these people together to engage in the act of socially constructing a new set of understandings about their situation, about each other's perspectives. And in those dialogue sessions and the sort of are based on these very clear theoretical commitments to social construction. And I think that's one place that it's made quite a big difference, and it fits with Saskia's interpretation of democracy and perhaps a liberal bias in that sense. But we'll talk about that later, maybe. The other place, though, that I think it's maybe more surprising to me to see social construction articulated by people who are not communication scholars has been in the world of public deliberation to me. And in the last 20 years or so, the political communication has taken what Dreisek calls the deliberative turn, kind of a play on some other, the linguistic turn, where rather than focusing attention on voting patterns and ideological parties, we've begun to look more at citizen discourse and citizens getting together in groups to talk through issues, weighing pros and cons, and what happens when that happens, making decisions. And traditional kind of notions of deliberation have been based in this more kind of rational analytic paradigm of problem solving, but just recently, a lot of work has started to look at what happens when these groups come together and has been using the language of social construction. So, an example, I guess. Recently, I was at the Kettering Foundation, which is an organization that hosts and funds research on deliberative democracy, hosts forums, national issues forums. And they invited me to be part of a group of scholars from a lot of different disciplines who were looking at what they called epistemology and the role of the expert in public knowledge. And in this, there were people from political science, art education, physics, philosophy, women's studies, and I was the only person from communication. And the premise of this workshop, I'm going to read a little here so I don't get mixed up. The premise of the workshop was to discuss the difference between what the organizers called expert knowledge and what they called public knowledge, which they described as the knowledge that gets produced as people interact with each other. This public knowledge, they continued, is different from expert knowledge because it's inherently uncertain. It takes value conflicts into account, and it's developed out of a kind of practical understanding of community concerns. And to me, I hear phronesis, I hear praxis, I hear social construction of reality through interaction of citizens. And then during the conversation, David Matthews, the director of the Kettering Foundation, not a communication scholar, is a very nice Southern gentleman who likes to tell long stories, and he, which I think is fabulous, he noted that he understood public judgment as a way of making, public knowledge, as a way of making sound judgment that is socially constructed in the process of making decision. And later he said public scholars, meaning not people who study the public, but scholars who engage in active collaboration with members of the public, need to listen to the stories that community members tell about their community. He told several stories and made the claim that the story that a community tells about itself is the surest predictor of its behavior. And he said it's also probably not true, but that doesn't matter because they believe it. It says something about who they are. It says something about what they value. And that to me was interesting. And everybody jumped on that in the group. They really talked about how, as academics, to engage with the public, we needed to unlearn condescension and learn what he called, what somebody else, I think, called epistemic humility when working with community members. So I heard in this conversation a deep commitment to the theory and practice of social construction to a degree, and it was largely unarticulated as such, but I could hear it in the discourse of what they were saying. Part of the critique of expert knowledge was that the standards of rigor had overshadowed ethical and pragmatic concerns of the community members, and because of the over-reliance on sort of technical expertise and fact and rigor, expert knowledge has failed to acknowledge that it is actually socially constructed. Thus, expertise becomes reified, totalizing, and this was seen as very bad by the members of this workshop, and I think, I would agree with much of what was said there. And so a different kind of knowledge, they said public judgment, arising from conversations about values and public issues needed to be recognized as legitimate. Now, my own work is about storytelling and narrative and in public discourse, and I found all of these things very heartening to hear people who were not communication scholars talking about. And I think it's a place where we've made a difference or could make a difference that's probably under-articulated. Mm-hmm. So. I also want to respond a little bit to the second question, and I think this is probably why Saskia put me last, is my guess. So John characterized my answer as yes and actually at first I called my paper yes and then I changed my mind, and I decided since it was supposed to be a provocative question, I would go ahead and let myself be provoked, and so I said no. No, I don't think that social construction, as the way that this question was posed, ought to be considered sort of the foundation for communication theorizing, and I say that not because I think it's wrong, but I don't. I have been heavily influenced by John Stewart and the notion of sort of what it is, that it is, the sort of materialist and the meaning conceptions of reality make total sense to me and are really grounding in the way that I do my own work. However, as somebody who studies public discourse and public dialogue, I am very nervous around what I see as kind of totalizing statements. And so I have been just asking some of my colleagues who are not in this room and would not probably choose to be in this room and engaged in a conversation in this way, do you see social construction at the heart of your work? Do you think that social construction ought to be, the basis of what you do? And I usually get why are you asking me that? Kind of a question. I've asked this of some of my students who just flat out won't answer me, and some of my colleagues, and also of some of my close relations who are in other disciplines. And so, yeah. So part of what I want us to think about is, are we inciting sort of paradigm wars? And if so, is that where we want to go? And I don't think we want to do that, and I don't think anybody here would say that we want to do that. But part of what I love about my academic home is that we have this commitment to multivocality and multiple approaches to doing communication, theorizing, and research. And so I really appreciate that there are post-positivists in the department doing experimental research and large-scale surveys, and they work collegially with autoethnographers, social network analysis, discourse analysis, rhetoricians, and critical scholars, right? And what we're united by is this intense curiosity about human interaction and communication. And I see that as meaning-making, and I see that as social construction, but they don't necessarily, and I think, who am I to tell them that they should? So, part of what I raise in my paper here is I wonder, like, where should we go from this? And I'm intrigued by a piece in 1999 by Martin and Nakayama talking about dialectical approaches to communication and culture, and they provide sort of 4 different ways in which paradigms can relate that they see. And one is sort of a liberal pluralism where paradigms are all kind of seen as equal, but nobody really talks to each other about it. You know, you do that separate but equal kind of a thing. Then the interparadigmatic borrowing, where you might take a little of this, take a little of that from different paradigms, but still operating within our own paradigms. Multi-paradigmatic collaboration, where we would work across, like collaborate with people who are taking different approaches to understanding even the very fundamental thing that we're studying, and collaborating to create something together. And then the 4th is this dialectical perspective. And the dialectical, I'm just going to quote Martin and Nakayama because they say it a lot better than I could. This position moves beyond paradigmatic thinking, but it's even more challenging than the multi-paradigmatic research in that it seeks to find a way to live with the inherent contradictions and seemingly mutual exclusivity of various approaches. That is, a dialectical approach accepts that human nature is probably both creative and deterministic, that research goals can be to predict, describe, and change, and that the relationship between, and they were studying culture, thinking about culture, both culture and communication is most likely both reciprocal and contested. And so I guess what I would want to wonder about, on the one hand, I think, yay, let's do this sort of dialectical understanding of communication. What would that mean? What would that look like? And on the other hand, I wonder, is that an inherently social constructionist kind of perspective and move? And would my colleagues who didn't answer my question in the first place be involved in a conversation that was framed around dialectics? I'm not sure. Maybe. I'm not sure. So I guess just my last question then, if they're not willing to come to the table and have these kind of conversations, then are we asking the right questions? And then linking back to my first observation about public knowledge, I wonder what public knowledge would we create by deliberative or dialogic conversations about these issues.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, I think at this point I would like to open it up to the floor and also invite the people here to join the conversation, open the conversation in the sense of an emerging dialogue, I hope, as far as we can have that in this very big room. So there are a couple of, just to summarize this a little bit, a couple of issues here on the table. One of them, the construction of disciplinary knowledge itself, and I think this is a big issue that we have been thinking about in communication studies for a long time and are still doing so. The fundamental question of, again, what I mentioned before, and I think Laura and John would be interesting also to engage in an argument here about the that's and the what's. And what should we do with the social constructionist notion? On the one hand, regarding language as we cannot get out of language, whether verbal or nonverbal. This perspective. So what do we do with that? And at the same time saying from a social constructionist notion we should accept and encourage the expression of multiple voices. So where do we stand here? The idea of scope and fragmentation and dialectics in the end. So there are a couple of issues here, and again, I don't know if anybody here would like to make another comment, or absolutely, we have like a little bit more than 15 minutes. Any questions?
I'd like to hear a little bit more of discussion about paradigm wars. First of all, because I really like that phrase. Secondly, as a graduate student, when I began my studies many years ago, I went to a department where they weren't so tolerant of opposing ontological positions. And in the very first class, in the theory class, all the graduate students were told that they had to choose an ontological position. And I wonder,
Ouch.
I mean, and okay, it was like, you choose an ontological position.
What was that?
But it's up to you, but it was really clear that the person who asked us to choose had a real idea of
About what your choice ought to be. Yeah.
we should choose. And I wonder if you could speak to this in the sense of education and, getting students as sort of collateral damage in the paradigm.
I want to say something first just about the fact of doing this. One of the most useful discussions I've seen by an anthropologist of ethnocentrism suggests that, and I've read this long enough ago that I have no idea who wrote it, but I know it was not original with me. Obviously, every single group assumes that they are right, because why would they hold those positions if they weren't right? So ethnocentrism is about the fact that not only do we assume what we're doing makes sense, but we assume this is the best possible way of doing things, because if it weren't, we wouldn't be doing it. So I have to start there.
This is a really interesting issue, and I guess the notion of ethnocentrism itself can be problematized, and that would be a fruitful thing to do, and one thing that we're led by at least some impulses in the discipline of philosophy. Let me try this as a contribution to the conversation, where Saskia identifies a democratic impulse as one of the elements of narrowness of social construction, and I think that's a really good critique. I would characterize what's creating the narrowing, and I used the word coherence before, as philosophical anthropology, not culture. Now, I think there's all kinds of conversation we could have about whether my understanding of this is apt and can be defended, but it's the way I'm thinking about it. Immanuel Kant was a person who argued that philosophy begins with philosophical anthropology. What's the nature of the human being? And so where if one is committed to the notion that humans are social animals, just to keep this really in a simplistic form, which of course is a social construction, yes. If one is committed to the notion that humans are social animals, then democracy in some form, or at least democratic deliberation, public discourse, attendance to the co-construction of meaning-making and its outcomes on social structures and systems, the whole notion of being critical from a feminist or a post-colonial perspective of how discourses are being hegemonic, all of that follows, it can be seen, following from a philosophical anthropological commitment, a commitment to an understanding about what is it to be a human being. If Heidegger's argument is coherent, that what we do, the way we do humanness, is to collaborate on interpretations. Language, I see that term covering verbal, nonverbal, interactive. Languaging is our way of being human. That could be called an ontological or a philosophical anthropological position. Then it seems to me the question, well, are we going to have multiple philosophical anthropologies then, or are we going to try? that you could say, gee, can we operate that way and continue conversing with each other? I mean, pluralism is a really good thing, and it can be, well, confusing is the first thing. Anyway, that's, what do you think?
Well, to get to your point on education, I guess I'll just tell a story about my own experience, because that's the way that I like to enter into this conversation. The first quarter of my master's program, I believed that I was going to be a communication consultant, and I was going to get a concurrent MA and an MBA, and that was I don't know if you even remember those conversations, that was what I thought I wanted to do. But then I talked my way into taking John Stewart's Philosophy of Interpretive Research class as my first introduction to graduate school. And at the same time, I was taking research methods and social statistics from one of the faculty members who came to us from Michigan State. And boy, was I messed up that whole quarter. I was so mixed up. I didn't know what to think. And I spent I loved it, but it was very confusing. And I spent my whole, probably first 2/3 of the methods class arguing with the basic premise of whether or not we could know any truth, and whether truth was there, and whether people actually had true scores of some other variable in their head or not. And I didn't get past that until much later. And then a few quarters later, I wanted to do a research project with a couple of my graduate colleagues who have gone on to great academic careers in really different ways. And we thought, let's look at the same event. Let's study the same event from 3 different perspectives. I'll take interpretive, okay? You take critical, and you take post-positivist. And so we did this, and it was really difficult. we had an NCA presentation where we presented our findings on our kind of reflections of what it was like, and I was saying things like, well, I was going to be an interpretive scholar, but I kept seeing issues of power, and I didn't know whether I could talk about that or not. And my friend who was doing critical scholars was like, well, when you said you didn't want to step on my toes, I didn't know what that meant, and I kind of got upset about that. And then the social scientist was like, I don't really know what to think about what you guys are doing. And our respondent was like, this is a great idea, but, in the end, you really have to figure out which home you're going to live in, And so I agree that as graduate students, and I was very fortunate to be in a place where, and the place where I teach now is still doesn't want you to choose a home right away, right? And I think that's an important thing for graduate students. But I think grappling with, and apparently I am still grappling with this idea of what is my home and where is social construction in all of that. I think it's a process that is important for scholarly development. So I think it's something that should be foregrounded in our graduate education. Not that everybody should have to go through what I went through. That was kind of...
I'm speaking, I guess, maybe a bit from Marilyn Ellis, but also, I guess, from my own views. What you said brings up the issue of multivocality, which is an issue that was touched on in various ways in this panel, and especially, I think, Laura's paper touched on the tension with multivocality and how social constructionists would deal with it, because on the one hand, if we accept multivocality and all voices are equal, that kind of disturbs me, because there are things that happen in the world that I feel are wrong. I think about acts of genocide. I think about using rape as a tool of war, and that's a situation where I wouldn't feel comfortable saying all voices are equal. So it's a tension I feel as a social constructionist in terms of acknowledging constructions, but also not wanting all constructions to be validated. And with the point that Mary Elena was bringing up about social construction being relational, what that helps me with in thinking about this is that in recognizing there are different voices, we don't just have to leave them in isolation, but instead, I guess, think relationally, work things out relationally. The conversation Mary Elena discussed in her graduate seminar, I think, is an example of that, where instead of just leaving all views as is, they worked it out and talked about, well, what are the practical consequences of seeing things a particular way? And so I guess not quite an answer, perhaps a response to the issues you raised. I would just think about what are the ways that you can engage in relational, I hate to say conversation because of some of the issues Sagaska brought up, but what are some of the ways you can relate to others, and also what are the practical consequences in terms of having a particular voice in the conversation?
And I just quickly, so we can have like one or two more questions, want to finish this up. I see more and more the segmentation within communication in a way that we also see that as at NCA, I think, where the program gets thicker and thicker every year because we have all these divisions, and we are lucky, I think, that we have ours now. But at the same time, I think we can use, and I think that would also be in the social constructionist sense, we can come closer a little bit, whether we call it conversation or dialogue or whatever we want to call it, at least to try. And I think there are a lot of examples in graduate programs or collaborations that oftentimes can also go wrong. I worked at a medical school, and the idea was to combine communication scholars, anthropologists, statisticians, and behavioral scientists. And we worked on a patient-doctor interaction study, and we are still working on publishing those papers because there was not only internally a lot of things to work through, and we had weekly meetings not only to discuss the data, but to discuss, have a meta-discourse on how we approach our analysis. And it was very hard, and we had people assigned to acting as mediators. And if you want to call that a debate or whatever genre you want to call that, that doesn't matter at that point. But I think it's those things that we can also encourage our graduate students. There's a lot of talk about interdisciplinarity. I still think we can work more on creating the structures for this interdisciplinarity, and especially also the openness of faculty members and students at the same time to study different types of not only communication or communicating, but also ways to approaching those. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Yes, I think my question will be to you. From most of the presentation, you talk about social construction looking at the multiple voices and fragmentation. In the land of fragmentation, you suggested that there should be, you change the approach to transcultural approach, transcultural from European and North American approach. I want you to expand on what you meant by transcultural approach, especially where you are now talking about fragmentation, even within the European American approach.
Right, yeah, that's a good question. Well, fragmentation, I mainly refer to related to what we are doing as communication scholars, the bodies of literature that we are using and the claims we are making, that it's still, at least, and you can absolutely challenge me on that from my insight so far, it's still based on the interpersonal. Right, and I don't hear enough voices from like media scholars, for instance. So fragmentation within the type of phenomena we are studying. In terms of transcultural, I think there are different notions and versions of social constructionism, probably. And what I see here, it's mostly, I would say, and again, please challenge me on that, a North American conversation on what we should and can regard as social construction. I don't hear enough voices yet from other parts of the world and what their understanding is of and about social construction. Again, I don't mean to go into the nation model here, to say, maybe people from China should join the conversation. I'm saying this because I teach in Hong Kong, and there's a student of mine in the back. It's the idea being that we use frameworks here that have been developed in the global north most of the time, and we are teaching them to people and students in different parts of the world. But we don't hear back very much in publications, in conversations, in these conventions. So how people use social constructionist notions in Latin America, for instance, in Asia, in Africa, and what does it mean to the people? How can they change or challenge those frameworks? And whether you call or I call it transcultural, I'm still not sure if that term is right. But just the notion of that we might be able to expand the conversation here a little bit and include those voices. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yes, I will say that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Anything else? We have last question, yeah.
In response, or continuing her inquiry a little bit, something that concerns me about the way that was framed by your professor or the professors there is, doesn't it exaggerate personal agency when we talk about ontological commitments? Sort of individualistic, you've got to choose your ontological position. And here you have 5 or 6 choices. And is there any sense in which we need to talk to our students about how these things also choose us?
That's a good question.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're getting a resounding yes.
Yeah. How do you do that?
Presented with 2 choices. Okay, 2 ontological choices. Either reality exists outside of us and can be measured, or it's socially. And I think that phrase that you used, epistemic humility, is lacking sometimes on one side of that. At least that was my impression of it. And that made the conversation difficult. Because I feel like on the critical side, that makes total sense. And on the other side, it doesn't make sense to them. So, kind of what you were saying, there's absolutely.
I guess in defense of social science, the friends of mine and colleagues who practice social science and would self-identify as post-positivists, they get bummed out, I guess, is the really academic way to talk about this, when they see the critiques of their philosophical stance as being outdated and naive, in the same way that clearly, because we say we're social constructionists, we don't actually think we can walk through walls. Clearly that's not accurate, right? And maybe it's less exaggerated and harder for us to see, but the social scientists I think about, I talk to, they say, who are you arguing with when you're talking about positive? Nobody thinks that way anymore, and maybe they're wrong about that, but they're saying you're not, the nature of science is that you look for patterns, you look for probabilities when you update your beliefs, when you find things that aren't supported, and we're learning, it's a process. We're not trying to find capital T truth. We're trying to find patterns that are based on theories that help us understand what we experience. And to me, that sounds a lot like social construction. And so I think that it is an important conversation to have.
I just want to say, too, in my current academic role, it's not the issue that it was during my graduate education, where the critical and the social sciences actually split off into different departments and could not seem to cope within the same, or even call themselves the same discipline. So that's a rather extreme example, I think, that I was unprepared for that when I entered. So.
Sure. John, do you want to make a final comment?
No, she's got a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. We are kind of out of time, so maybe a quick, sorry, but I don't want to interrupt you.
Just a quick remark. Isn't the conversation also difficult because it's embedded in language, and it's very hard when you're in a post-positivist paradigm not to talk about meanings and interpretations rather than facts, and vice versa.
Yes. Yes.
I think we need to stop.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for your final remark. Very brief. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much.